Okay, good day everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I can hear myself. Yeah, all good? Okay, so I'm going to kick off today by telling you that I'm talking probably about my favorite topic, educationally rich mathematical games. So I'm very privileged to be here, beamed into you guys. And I'm going to start with a game. And so this is the game I'm going to be playing with you guys today. It's called The King's Tax. Now, it's an adaptation of the classic probability game, Greedy Pig. But instead of using dice, we're using cards. So this means the probabilities will be changing constantly based on what cards have been turned over. So we're actually planting the seed of conditional probability with this game as well. So we begin by shuffling the deck. Now, I encourage you to play along with me. However, because it's going to be very hard to interact in real time, I'm just going to play with my dear friend here, Tracy. So Tracy is going to stand in for you guys because I can't be there. But I encourage you to play along in your seats. Okay, so I'm shuffling my cards. I'm going to turn over a card. Whatever I turn over, the value of that card is how much money you get. Okay. So you can either, after I've turned over a card, choose to bank the money, or you can choose to have another card. Okay. And the game continues. You can tip on every turn. You can either bank or you can take another card. Just like Greedy Pig with the dice roll. Okay. There's some special cards that need to be thought about. If a king is turned over, he collects his tax. Players who are still in the game get nothing for that round. If a queen is turned over, players who are still in double their score for the round. And if a jack is turned over, players get a $15 bonus. All right. One other thing is the joker's wild. Now, we're going to make the joker $0 for our game, but the joker is wild and players can decide before the game what they want the value of the joker to be. Okay, let's get into our game. Okay, so there's at least 4 rounds in this game because there's 4 kings, but there might be more rounds depending on when the players stop. So I'm going to be demonstrating my game with Tracy. Okay, Tracy, you ready? Okay, she's ready. All right, so our first card is a joker. We're just going to treat joker as 0. Our next card is a 2. Okay, so Tracy and I are on $2. We don't want to bank $2. It's not enough money. 2 and 5, $7. Tracy, what do you think? You want to stay in the game? All right, we'll go another card. 7 and 7 is $14. What about you, Tracy? You getting nervous? You want one more? Okay. 14 and 9 is 14 and 10 is 24. 1 less is 23. So hopefully you're playing along as well. Tracy's had enough. She's seen enough. She's going to bank her $23. But James, that's me. I'm continuing because I think I can get more money. Oh, brutal. I've brought a king. So Tracy wins that round. I get $0 for the round. Tracy wins $23. We'll play one more round just for fun. Okay. Jack. Now remember, Jack is worth $15. Okay, so we're both on 15 for this round. Tracy, you want to stay in? Okay. 15 and 10, $25. We're going to double 25 because it's a queen. $50. Oh, all right, Tracy, what do you think? She wants to stay in, but that's enough for me. $50. All right. Tracy wants to see another card. All right, Trace. She's got a 7. 50 and 7. 57. Okay, one more, Trace, or you? Oh, okay. Oh, Tracy got greedy. She gets $0 for the round. So our score update after 2 rounds would be James on $50, Tracy on $23. So you can see how there's all sorts of interesting mathematical ideas embedded in that game. But depending on how many kings have come up and when they come up in the game, players are going to need to adjust their strategies accordingly. All right. So it's a fantastic game to play. It was designed initially for a remote learning setting, and it works just as well in the classroom. All right. So what am I going to be talking to you about today? Well, I'm going to be introducing the 5 principles of educationally rich mathematical games. And you can see there it says 5+1 principles. That's because after the fact where we wrote this article about these 5 principles, we decided there's at least one other principle that's worth thinking about. We're going to evaluate games and connect them back to these principles. We're going to present some research into mathematical games. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some questions. Okay, now I want this session to be interactive. And I know that's difficult because it's hard to have synchronous reaction. But there's a code here that's going to help us. So when the blue text comes up, I want you to have a discussion with the person beside you. And when the green comes up, it's an opportunity for a personal reflection. Okay, so blue discussion, green reflection. We're going to see how that works. Now, you have to be a really well-behaved audience because I have no ability to manage your behavior from over here. Soon as I say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I'm going to count you back in. You need to stop your discussion and attend to me. All right, so we're going to try it. All right, so I'm praying it goes well because I'm not getting a lot of feedback. Okay, so my first opportunity for you guys, or your first opportunity to have a discussion, is to consider the question, how do you decide which maths games to play in your classroom? If you decide at all to play maths games, how do you decide which maths games to play? So I'm going to give you around 2 minutes to have a chat with the person next to you. Obviously, if you're on Zoom or in the Adobe Connect, our virtual presentation platform, you can be using the chat function there. Okay, so how do you decide which maths games to play in your classroom? Okay, I'm going to try to count you back in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Hopefully I have all your attention back. Okay. So you've had a discussion about how you decide which maths games to play in your classroom. And this is a discussion I've had, a lot with teachers and sort of reflecting on my own practice, the practice of others, looking at a little bit at what the research says, but as we'll find out in a minute, the research into maths games is actually pretty bare. Myself, Toby, my brother, and Alicia Bragg came up with 5 principles of educationally rich mathematical games. Now, the point of these principles is they should be pretty common sense. When we go through them, they probably will echo some of the ideas you were discussing. But the idea is that mathematical games are widely used in the classroom, but not all games are equally good, right? Not all games are equally good. And so how might we decide which specific games to play in our classroom? So this is sort of to offer some guidance to teachers and as a way of collating our own thoughts and reflections about what we think are some good principles of mathematical games or principles of good mathematical games. Okay, so these are the 5 principles. The first principle, students are engaged. The second principle, that skill and luck are balanced. The third principle, that mathematics is central to the game. The fourth principle, that there's some flexibility for learning and teaching. And the fifth principle, there's opportunities to support homeschool connections. So I'm going to go through each of these principles in turn and use some examples to illustrate them. Okay, so first principle, probably something that you discussed, I'm pretty confident. Students are engaged. Okay, games should be engaging, enjoyable, and generate mathematical discussion. This is the comparative advantage games have, right? Games will engage students. It's been demonstrated by Leisha as part of her thesis that games generate more on-task behavior and more mathematical dialogue, student-to-student dialogue, than non-game activities, even very rich non-game activities. So it turned out, with Leisha's thesis anyway, the games did not have a larger impact on learning outcomes than equivalent rich problem-solving tasks. In fact, the rich problem-solving tasks were a little bit stronger in relation to long-term outcomes, particularly over the longer term. But what games did do is they led to more on-task behavior, which is a measure of engagement, and more dialogue between students, more mathematical discussion than the non-game-based activities. So the principle that emerges from this, or the idea that emerges from this, is that games students are not motivated to play are unlikely to generate positive learning outcomes compared with alternative activities. Now, seems pretty common sense, but I would argue if a game's not highly engaging, if students are reluctant to play it, there probably is a better activity out there that students could be doing instead. Okay, so my question to you, and this is a reflection question because it's in green, is what is it about the King's tax that makes it engaging? So you might have been playing alongside me, or you might have just watching Tracy and I play. But what is it about the King's tax that makes it engaging to play? I'll give you a few moments to collect your thoughts around that. If you don't have a pen and paper out there or a laptop in front of you, I'd encourage you to do so, because there's going to be quite a few opportunities for this sort of reflection as we go along. Okay, these are some of my thoughts around why I think that King's Tax is an engaging game. Okay, it's competitive, right? Competition is an important aspect of engagement, some sort of competition. Now, it doesn't have to be individual competition. Sometimes it can be groups of students playing against other groups of students, or it can be the entire class playing against the teacher. But competition is one energizing aspect of a game. It's fast-paced. Okay, so it is a dynamic, fast-paced game. Depending on how you play it, it may well involve some physical movement. So if you think back to how we play Greedy Pig, and this is how I play King's Tax in the classroom, is I get players to stand up to demonstrate that they're in the game, and to sit down when they're passing on that round. And there's definitely some preliminary evidence to say that physical movement seems an important aspect of games that are particularly engaging. Students do like to be physically engaged. The mechanics of the game is simple, so students can get a handle on the game pretty easily, and this supports engagement. And the whole class can play with a personal stake. So you could play it in a group of 25, you could play it in a group of 5, you could play it in a group of 3 or 4. I actually wouldn't recommend, in general, playing it in a group of 2, although it does work fine in a group of 2. But in some ways, the more the merrier. But the notion that you can engage the whole class in a game where they've got their own personal stake in the game, they're highly engaged in how the game's unfolding, is a powerful aspect of the King's Tax, or Greedy Pig, or an equivalent game. Right. Okay, now back to you in terms of having a bit of a discussion. What are some maths games that you play in your classrooms that are highly engaging for students? So I'm going to give you another minute or two to have a chat with the person next to you around what games you think are highly engaging. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, thanks for coming back on the count. Okay, so I can think of a whole bunch of games that I like. And one of the first things I'm going to go through in my mind is how engaging is it for students to play? So I think this is a really common sense, but a really important principle. But the second principle is perhaps a little less intuitive, but I think very important as well. this notion that skill and luck are balanced. So without luck, more able students will tend to dominate a game. Right, so there's no luck at all. If it's just about skill, more able students will dominate. Now, this can be motivating, particularly if students have a sort of a high sense of self-efficacy. They believe that they can succeed, and that they believe that, you know, through hard work and through engaging with people who are better at the game, that they're actually going to improve. But that's certainly not all students all the time. So it can actually be a bit of a barrier to motivating students to play games if they're just skill-based. But of course, without skill, intrinsic motivation to play the game is limited. Okay, so luck games might capture student attention for some time, but they're unlikely to be sustained over time unless there's some skill involved. And some sort of player choice, some sort of deliberate interaction with other players. So the balance between luck and skill, I would argue, is what engages students. And of course, the balance can have a positive social impact as well. At some point in life, everyone needs to learn to be a good loser or gracious winner, because it doesn't matter how capable we are, we can certainly be unlucky in life, right? So we need to be able to lose with good grace. And that's obviously a challenging social skill for lots of students to learn. So I think there's a lot to be said about trying to get skill and luck to be balanced. And we might think of two extreme examples of games here. In terms of a pure luck game, at least in terms of how it's normally played, we have snakes and ladders. In terms of what we might think of as a pure skill game, we have chess. So why is snakes and ladders pure luck? Well, in the traditional version of the game, I'm rolling my dice, I'm moving up my board. If I get to a snake, I go down the snake. If I get to a ladder, I climb up the ladder first to the end, or 100, depending on how the board's designed, is the winner. Okay, so it's luck, right? On the other hand, we have chess. Now, amongst novices, chess is a pure skill game, right? So that sounds a bit weird, right? But if I was to play chess against my brother Toby, the better player pretty much is always going to win, right? Within, you know, probably some margin. Now, amongst people who are really skilled at chess, there's a small amount of luck involved in the game, and that's actually to do with who gets to go first. So if you're white in chess, you get to play first. And amongst professional chess players, white will win about 55%, and black will win about 45% of games that end with a result. So white's advantage somewhat has a slight amount of luck because they get to go first, but chess is very close to a pure skill game. So where might we put the king's tax on this continuum? Depending on how you set up the game a little bit, so in particular, depending on what value you give the joker, I'd say the king's tax is more luck than skill, but certainly still has some skill, right? The skills around strategy, but there's certainly some luck because, you know, you could play the game optimally in terms of strategy and not win all the time. In fact, you'd still win a very small percentage of the time if you're playing in a large group, even if you played sort of the mathematically perfect strategy. All right, so that's where I put the king's tax. This is a reflection for you guys now. Think of some games that you play in your classroom. Where do you think they might belong on the luck skill continuum? So maybe think of 3 other games and you could map them on this luck skill line we've got there. Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a think about a couple of other games that you play and where you'd put them on this continuum. I want to make the point though, and this is pretty obvious, that just because some games don't have a lot of skill in them, such as snakes and ladders, doesn't mean we can't introduce an aspect of skill. So we can obviously modify games to improve the balance between luck and skill. We could think about a way we can modify a game like chess to improve the balance. We'd actually want to maybe introduce a bit more luck if we're using it as a classroom game, possibly. Don't want to upset any chess purists out there. But let's pick snakes and ladders as our example. And I want you to have a discussion with the person next to you. What might be some modifications we can make to snakes and ladders to introduce some skill into the game? Right, so I want to use it in the classroom. I don't want it just to be a luck game. How could I introduce some skill? And maybe when we're introducing some skill, there's an opportunity to introduce or to deepen the mathematical thinking around the game as well. Right, so this is your challenge. Come up with some modifications for snakes and ladders to introduce some skill into the game. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, I'm sure you came up with some really interesting modifications. Here's a few I've come up with and a few of which I've tried out as well. Really obvious one is to introduce a second counter. In fact, this is when I play with my daughter, who's now 7, but when we used to play Snakes and Ladders, don't play as much these days. I insisted that I'd only play with her if we could play with 2 counters. And it's as simple as players choose which counter to move on their turn. So just introducing some aspect of player choice. You're thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't move this counter because it's close to a ladder. I'm going to wait a couple of turns to see if I can roll a 2 and go up that ladder. I'm just going to move my other counter. It makes the game automatically a lot more complex and interesting. This idea that Tierney Kennedy introduced me to, this notion that players can move forwards or backwards on their turn to try to maximize the position. So sometimes if you roll a 2, you might go back 2 places to take advantage of going up a ladder, or you go back 2 places to avoid a snake perhaps. So that's another way. The third way, maybe introducing a little bit of mental computation and simple addition, would be to roll 3 dice, so maybe 3 10-sided dice or 3 6-sided dice, and get players to discard 1, so decide which one they want to get rid of, sum the other 2 together, and move that many places. So let's pretend they were 6-sided dice. If I had a 5, a 4, and a 1, I could decide I might move 5 plus 4, 9 places, or I could decide to move 5 plus 1, 6 places, or 4 plus 1, 5 places. I'd have some choices. So those 3 simple ideas for making the game a little bit more dynamic and introducing some skill. I'm sure you guys came up with several others. Okay, this is the third principle, and this is, I think, really important. For me, it's not enough that the mathematical purpose is kind of tacked onto a game. It's really good if the sort of central gameplay is engaging players. Right? So the central gameplay is engaging players in the mathematics, the key mathematical idea. Right? So our chosen game matches specific learning objectives. But having said that, it's important to note that games could be focused on a bunch of different learning objectives. It could be around skill practice, such as practicing addition facts. It could be around deepening understanding of an important concept, such as place value. It could be exposing students to new concepts, such as conditional probability. And there's one way of thinking about the King's tax where it is exposing students to that notion of conditional probability. And of course, it could be around strategic thinking or problem solving. And the classic example is NIN games. So in its original play, it might be that there's 7 counters down on the, say on the table, and on their turn, players can choose whether to grab 1 counter or grab 2 counters, and whoever grabs the last counter is the winner. Okay, so something like that, even though it doesn't have any focus on anything to do with mental computation, still mathematical. It's about strategy. It's about problem solving. Okay, so we're going to play a game now. You might know it. It's been modified a little bit. It's called Beat the Teacher Biggest Difference. And the basic mechanics are the teacher rolls a 10-sided dice, and I'm going to be the teacher, but you're all going to play along with me. On each roll, students individually or in pairs, so you could be playing collaboratively. It's up to you. I'm going to leave that up to you. You got that choice. Which place value slot to assign the number rolled. The teacher will keep rolling the dice until all place value slots are filled up. And whoever ends up with the biggest difference is the winner. So you're trying to get the biggest difference. Okay, so this is what our game board looks like. So I'm going to roll the dice 6 times, and we're going to have a 3-digit number subtracted from another 3-digit number. And on each roll, you need to decide where you're going to put your place value, what you're going to put in each place value slot. But I'm not going to show you what I'm doing. I don't want to give away my strategy, but I'll stop and tell you what I roll each time. Okay, so my first roll, so hopefully you've got your game board. I'll give you a moment to draw up your game board if you haven't already. Get your game board drawn up digitally or using pen and paper. Okay. First roll. Whoop. I have here a 3. Remember, our objective is to make the biggest difference. So you need to decide where you're going to put the 3. Okay, I'll put the 3 somewhere. Now I'm going to roll again. This time it's a 4. Where are you going to put the 4? The next one's a 9. Where are you going to put your 9? Okay. The next number is a 6. Where are you going to put your 6? The next number is a 1. Where are you going to put your 1? And I should have told you and I didn't, but this dice does have a 0 on it. So 1 is low, but it's not our lowest number. And our last roll's a 2. So put the 2 in the last place value slot. You should have 6 numbers. Okay. So my subtraction is 964 subtract 132. That's what I came up with. And my difference is 832. So we're trying to make the biggest difference. And my difference was 832. I don't know if you can see it there, but might be able to, maybe not. It's probably a little bit glary actually. But 832 is my difference. So there was a way of beating me. I almost had the perfect number, but not quite. There was a way of getting a higher difference. So I wonder if anyone managed to beat me. Now, one thing about maths games, particularly maths games that involve any sort of real strategy or thought, is you want to play them more than once because you want to refine your strategy. So I'm going to give you a chance to beat me again because I played this game probably more than you have. So if you didn't beat me that time, have a crack at beating me again. So I'm going to drop another game board, another 6 boxes. Okay, and I'm going to roll the dice again. I rolled an 8. So think about where you want to put your 8. I've rolled a 2. Think about where you want to put your 2. I've rolled another 2. Where do you want to put that 2? I've rolled a 0. Now you can of course put the 0 in any place value slot you like. So it can be in front of a number if you wish. I've rolled a 5. And my last roll is an 8. All right. I'm pretty confident that someone's got a bigger difference than me. My subtraction was 858 subtract 220. So it's 638. Now I'm pretty confident, I can't see you out there, but I'm pretty confident that someone's beat the teacher on this occasion because I didn't have my 0 where I really would have liked it, which is in the 100 slot on the bottom row there. Okay, so this is the game, beat the teacher, biggest difference. Okay, so my question to you, and this is a reflection question, so I'll give you a minute or so to reflect on it. How is mathematics central to beat the teacher, biggest difference? How is mathematics central to this game? So just have a reflect on that. Okay, so these were my thoughts around how I think mathematics is central to this game. The primary learning focus is on place value. We want students to spend as much of their playing time thinking about place value ideas as possible. The complexity that is trying to come up with the biggest difference means that most students are unlikely to develop heuristics, at least on the first few plays. This can be contrasted with a bigger number type game. So it's not that easy just to work out what the kind of, I guess, the strategies on this game on the first couple of plays. It takes quite a lot of plays for you to work out, okay, so if I get a 9, I'm going to put it there, and if I get a 0, I'm going to put it there every time, and if I get a middle number, I've got to put it there. It's not that obvious compared to a game where you're just trying to make the biggest number, where the strategy becomes very straightforward. Now, the danger of that is students can start to use a heuristic where I just need to rank the numbers in order. And I don't actually have to engage with the place value concept at all. I just need to know that 9's bigger than 8, that's bigger than 7. So I don't have to think about 987. I can just think of 9 bigger than 8, bigger than 7. But you can't use a heuristic like that, or at least not very easily, for a game that's a little bit more complex. So this is why I think this is actually, even though it's about subtraction as well, it actually more deeply engages students in place value than just a make the biggest number type of game. Very importantly, on every single turn, students are thinking about place value. So you come back to that first idea, the primary learning objective is place value. We want students to spend as much of their playing time thinking about this idea as possible. On every single turn, they're faced with a decision. They have to think, what value do I want to assign to this digit? Is it going to be 4 10s? Is it going to be 4 hundreds? 4 ones? Is it going to be in the top number or the bottom number? And why? What's my rationale? They're having to make that, or having to have that thought constantly, right? And this can even be enhanced further if you open up the game so they're playing in pairs. All right, so that's one of the reasons I like this game, even though it's very simple in its mechanics, because students are really engaging the key mathematical focus on every turn. Okay, the fourth principle is flexibility for learning and teaching. Now, one of the aspects of this flexibility, there are others, but the one that I want to talk about more today is this notion that games can be used to differentiate in the classroom. There's a few different ways this can happen. Now, if you have mixed ability groups set up in the classroom and they're playing the same game, maybe you're playing the King's Tax in small groups of, say, 4. The notion is games can differentiate according to game dynamics, right? Which is just how players are engaging in the game as it's been set up. So, say, take the King's Tax example. There might be some students who are using counting-based strategies or using a hundreds chart to track what's happening in the game. There might be other students using more sophisticated mental strategies like partitioning numbers, bridging through 10, compensation style strategies. So you're going to have a whole suite of strategies, but everyone engaging in the same core game. The advantage of just differentiating through game dynamics is it provides plenty of opportunities in mixed ability groups for students to learn from each other. Okay, so that's one option we have. It's probably the preferred option a lot of the time for teachers, but it's certainly not our only option. Another way of differentiating the game is through game mechanics. Now, this would typically involve us organising students according to similar ability groups, typically, and we'd make some modifications. So depending on the game, we might, for example, increase the number of place value slots So if we were playing our game, beat the teacher, biggest difference, we might be playing with thousands numbers, or we might just be playing with 2-digit numbers. So it's a really simple way of, a simple example of modifying a game to open it up to a broader variety of students, but they're still actually engaged in the same game, and the strategy is actually really similar. So when you come together for your post-task discussion, your post-game discussion, students who are playing with 2-digit, subtract 2-digit numbers can still contribute to the discussion, and a lot of their points are still going to be relevant because the same principles apply as those students who are playing with larger numbers. And the last point, which I briefly mentioned before, is, of course, games can be differentiated through supporting materials. So maybe the rules are the same, but some students are using, for example, hundreds charts to support their thinking as they track through with a game like King's Tax. So the fact that games are flexible is one of the things that makes them really appealing. The other thing I'd add around the flexibility that I think is really powerful is that once students are used to a particular game mechanic, you can actually leverage off that mechanic to explore a new concept. So there might be a chance to explore a new mathematical idea using established mechanics. Bingo games are classic examples of that. So, you think about a bingo game where you've got to get, say, 4 numbers in a row to score bingo. Be using that game with an addition focus, with a multiplication focus, lots of other different foci as well. So games are inherently flexible beasts, which is one of the reasons that teachers really like them. Okay, this is a discussion question. So I'm going to ask you to choose one or more of the games that we've played so far. So the King's Tax, we haven't played Snakes and Ladders, but we've discussed it. And beat the teacher, biggest difference. How might we modify these games so they are suitable for lower performing students or high performing students, or perhaps younger and older students? Now, some of the modifications are really obvious, but I'm going to give you some time to sort of unpack these games and think carefully about what's the potential modifications to open up these games. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thanks for coming back. Okay, so hopefully you had some good discussion around how you might modify these games. I think there's potential for all 3 of those games, for example, the way I think about it, to be used with at least sort of year 1 to year 6 students, possibly even prep or foundation students as well. So preschool students. Okay, so the last principle of our original 5 was that playing games can facilitate homeschool connections. And that has been particularly relevant in Victoria this year, and obviously around Australia as well, but particularly Victoria, given that schools have been shut for about half the year. Games can be a tool for building positive connections between home and school. Okay, so the first point there is that it helps parents/carers understand mathematical concepts being taught. So they might be a little bit curious or interested in, what mathematics are you learning about in school? Well, if you come home to play a game with mum or dad, that's a chance for mum or dad to learn about the concepts that are being taught in the classroom. The second point's really important, I think. These days, when we're teaching mathematics, we place a lot of emphasis on students' mathematical reasoning, and that's not necessarily reflective of how a lot of our parents and even ourselves experience mathematics education. So there was a lot of emphasis on, rote recall when I was at school, for example, and much less emphasis on reasoning. And that's pretty much been inverted over the last, say, 3 decades or so, increasingly so. So by playing really rich games, which enable opportunities for students to reason mathematically, hopefully parents can see the value of these reasoning strategies to support mathematical thinking. Another thing that I really like about mathematical games being taken into the home environment is it places students in the role of expert. So they'll come home with a game that they've played at school, and their homework is to play it with mum or dad, but of course they have to teach mum and dad the game, and they understand the ins and outs of the game, hopefully. And there's a chance there for them to obviously often have an advantage in the game because they know more about it than mum or dad. And there's some nice stories which I'll talk about in a moment in relation to this. Games that lend themselves well to homeschool connections, given this is a principle, are games that are simple in their structure and have easily available materials. So classic games like card games or even dice games, given that even if parents don't have dice in their home environment, you can get dice virtually very easily. Okay, so cards and dice games, games that have specialized materials obviously are less appropriate for the home environment. Okay, as I said earlier, this has been a key aspect of our emphasis in 2020 with remote learning has been on playing games. It's also required us to think about games that lend themselves to sort of virtual environments like Zoom. So playing a game on Zoom requires the game to be set up a little bit differently. Often you just want to be using something really simple like virtual cards. So there's some really good websites out there that just have a virtual deck of cards that you can play. And that's actually how the King's Tax got developed. Toby, my brother, had to play a game with his year 5-6 students, and he wanted a simple game that would engage everybody and practice mental computation and introduce conditional probability. And he came up with the King's Tax as a variant on Greedy Pig, but it works beautifully in an online environment. Okay, so this video is from a project. I'm not going to show the video today because you can always YouTube it in your own time, but this video is from a project that Toby set up in his school a couple of years ago. And basically for a term, students' maths homework was playing a game with mum or dad. So what we did is we developed a little YouTube video introducing the game, sort of what's required, how do you play it, where's the mathematics, that kind of thing. And for 2 weeks, students were encouraged to play that game at home with mum or dad or a sibling. And then after 2 weeks, we'd switch to another game. There was 4 games across the term. And the feedback from students was really positive. They were highly engaged. And there was this notion that students were the experts because they knew more about the game. And one of the strategy games that a student took home and played with a sibling, an older sibling in year 9, they were particularly excited about because they sort of learnt the trick to this game and they were able to beat their sister time and time again, even though she was in year 9 and they were in year 5. So it can be very satisfying for the student to be placed in that position as expert, and it can actually improve how they feel about mathematics. So there's some real benefit in thinking about games that, if the more you play it, the better you get at it, and using those games for students to bring home to play against mum or dad or a sibling. Anyway, you can have a look at those on my YouTube channel, or Toby's YouTube channel possibly. But really, if you want to have a look at games that have been designed for maybe for use in the home environment, you should have a look at Michael Minnis's YouTube channel. It's a fantastic resource. He's got 66 game demonstrations up there and counting. He's adapted a game from games from a broad variety of mathematics educators, but it's something I'd highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. Okay, so the big question for us was, having written this paper about these 5 principles, which we'll link to and you can have a look at it if you like, were these 5 principles sufficient? Okay, did they capture what's in a good mathematical game? Of course, they probably weren't, right? And that became more evident as we went along, and we started to have discussions about what do we really value about maths games, and particularly thinking about the Maths 300 resource, which I used to use a lot as a classroom teacher, and I still use it on occasion. One of the really powerful things I found with that resource was they used game as a hook, and then they unpacked and investigated the game. So games into investigations. And so this notion of investigatability, a good game can be investigated. The educational value of a mathematical game is further enriched if it can be transformed into an investigation. Many games have tremendous potential to lead into investigations. Here are some potential angles. It's not exhaustive. You might come up with some others. But one idea is investigating game scenarios. Okay, so looking at a scenario in a game and getting students to explore it. That's the example we'll look at in a moment. Identifying/generalizing mathematical patterns that emerge when playing the game. Inquiring into the structure of the game. Like, for example, which player is advantaged and why. Often it's the first player, but not necessarily. Some games are set up so the second player has the advantage. What are the best numbers in the game, if it's a game like a bingo style game? And last, modifying the rules and taking note of what changes. So playing the game one way, changing the rules, and getting students to think about what's changed as their investigation. So this is something I get really excited about and something I try to use often when I'm playing a game. Often I'll play the game once, use it as our main activity. So we might play for 25 minutes or something like that. There'll be some other things around that, including a post-game discussion. Then the next time we might come in, we might play the game for 10 minutes again, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we might spend 20 minutes or longer investigating the game. Okay, so exploring a game scenario or seeing if students can make a generalization from the game, from a pattern that emerges in the game. Okay, let's think about the King's Tax. Here's an investigation. Andrea ended her round on 50 points. So she scored 50 points for that round. So if you think about how King's Tax worked, the Queen doubles your score. The King cancels your money for the round. The Jack's worth 15. And the Joker's wild in the sense that players decide before the game what its value is going to be. Remember, the Joker can do lots of things. It could be a number value, or it could do something like halve your score, or it could do something like subtract $20. It can do anything you like, really. Your challenge is, given that she ended on 50 points, I should say $50 really. So given she ended on $50, what order might the cards have been played in? So if she's the 3, the Queen, the 7, the 10, the 5, and the Joker have been played, what order might the cards have been played in? And what are some different possibilities for the value of the Joker? So see if you can come up with more than one answer to this. And you can do this on your own because it's in green. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to mull this over and see if you can come up with a couple of solutions. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to give that a little bit of thought. Now, I've only given you about 3 minutes or so to come up with some solutions, which isn't a lot of time at all. And obviously that's not sort of time we want to allow our students to work on a problem like this. But there's some interesting solutions to this problem, and there's some fairly straightforward ones as well. And here's some possibilities. So one possibility would just be to keep the order of the numbers exactly the same. Sorry, the order of the cards exactly the same. So we could have a 3, then we'd play our Queen, which would double our 3 to 6. 6 plus 7 is 13. 13 plus 10 is 23. 23 plus 5 is 28. And how much more to get to 50? Well, the Joker would have to be worth 22 in this game. So that's one possibility. Now, another possibility would be to leave the Joker to the end and play the Queen second to last. Now, if we did that, 7 plus 3 is 10, 10 plus 10 is 20, 20 plus 5 is 25, double 25 is 50, the Joker must be worth 0. I would say they're probably the two most straightforward solutions, because in that first solution, we haven't varied the order at all, and the Joker is basically whatever we need to make up to 50, it's the change. And in the second one, students are able to add together all the cards with a face value first, with a digital value first. So, sorry, a numerical value first. So 7, 3, 10, and 5, and then use the picture cards. So I think that's a bit more straightforward. And then there's a slightly more interesting scenario down there where the Joker's worth 5. So 7 plus 3 is 10. 10 plus 5 is 15. The Joker's played, and we're saying the Joker's worth 5, so that takes us to 20. The Queen's worth double, so 20 plus 20 is 40, and then the 10 would take us to 50. That third possibility is a lot more complex to come up with. So the easiest way is to think we'll play the Joker last, and then we don't have to worry about it. Once the Joker becomes somewhere in the middle of that investigation, it becomes a little bit more challenging. I'm sure you could come up with some really funky and interesting values for the Joker to make this investigation, this game scenario play out as well. Okay, so I have to say that this is probably the principle I'm most excited about in terms of what I actually pursue in the classroom. I really love turning games into investigations, as I said before. And taking a game scenario and getting students to unpack it and explore it like we've done here is probably the simplest way of turning a game into a rich investigation. So you could easily see how something like this could take up a whole chunk of a rich maths class, And one way of doing it as well, in terms of extending it further, is you get students to do their investigation, come up with a scenario which fits this problem, decide on the value of the joker, okay, and then tell another student, look, my joker's worth 22. Can you work out the order in which I played my cards, or Andrea played her cards in my scenario? Right, so you could actually take the investigation and extend it further by getting students to challenge each other. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and look at research into mathematical games. Given how central games are to primary maths instruction, at least anecdotally, right, to me, it's surprising how little research there is into games, particularly how teachers use games. There's very, very little research. I mean, there's a handful of research papers that look at how teachers use games. And a handful of research papers in amongst the thousands of papers that get published in maths education each year is not very many indeed. So to address this gap, we've recently undertaken some research, so we being Toby and Leisha and myself, to address the following question. How are games used by primary teachers to support mathematics instruction? So in some ways, we've sort of touched on this a little bit so far, but I want you to have a chat with the person next to you. How are games used by primary teachers to support mathematics instruction? What do you think? Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes to chew over that with the person next to you. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Thanks for coming back. Okay, so I hope you had a chance to have a bit of a chat about that. These are some of the questions we asked to explore that broader question. So how frequently do teachers play maths games in their classrooms? How do teachers incorporate maths games into their classroom routines and lesson structures? What are teachers' pedagogical aims when using maths games? And what are some of the characteristics of highly valued maths games? So I'm going to go through each of these questions in turn. But first, I'm just going to do this quickly, but I want you to make a prediction. So maybe just while I've got that slide up there, think, what percentage of teachers do you think report using a game all the time, which is say 4 to 5 times a week, basically every lesson? Often, say 2 to 3 times a week. Sometimes, say once a week. Rarely, once a month. Never. Now, we're talking about primary teachers, so you might be thinking about secondary as well, but probably the answers will be different. But thinking about primary teachers, what would be your guess? Going to give you a few moments to chew that over. Okay, so I'm going to show you some data in a moment around this first question. So the first study, we asked 135 Australian early years primary teachers, so foundation, year 1, year 2, from 28 Catholic schools in New South Wales and Victoria. Now, this was a convenient sample. These teachers were part of another project, but the important thing is that this other project had nothing to do with games. Okay, it was professional learning around teaching with sequences of challenging tasks. And we invited them to do a pre-programmed questionnaire. And we just had this one single item about maths games. Okay, so we even though it's not a random sample, we can be confident that this sample is reasonably reflective of at least this aspect of the education system in terms of how frequently games are played. Okay, so this is the data that came up. Half the teachers reported using games in every lesson. So this is early years primary teachers. And on top of that, 1/3 of the teachers reported using games 2 to 3 times a week. So we've got 86% of teachers around saying they're using games multiple times a week. 13% said sometimes, once per week. 2% rarely, and none of our respondents said never. So maybe one of the key takeaways is 98% of teachers, from this sample anyway, say they use games at least once a week, and every second teacher uses games every day. So it's pretty exciting for me because I love games, right? And seeing this data is like, just validates my thinking. It's like, why aren't we researching this more, given how important games are in terms of being a valued aspect of mathematics instruction? I really think that research should be looking to what's happening in classrooms, right? More than trying to dictate what should go on in classrooms, right? Let's look at what's happening, assume that teachers are doing these things for good reasons and learn from it, and then possibly then feed in and provide opportunities to further refine their instruction. Okay, but too often research, I think, comes from the point of view of we know better and we're going to tell you how to teach. Okay, now some research works that way quite well, I suppose, but I think it's really important to see what's going on in a classroom, what do teachers value, okay, and exploring that stuff. Okay, we also asked another sample of teachers, 248 Australian primary teachers. So this was an online questionnaire that teachers across foundation to year 6 completed. And these teachers were recruited using a snowball sample, beginning with 15 key informants. So we used a snowball sample, we sent it out to 15 people, and then they forwarded it on to their teachers, or teachers that they were connected to. So it's possible that these teachers did have a particular interest in games. All right, so interestingly, the data played out this way, where teachers still reported playing games often, but a little less often than our other sample. So about a third of the teachers said they played games all the time, every single lesson. And about half the teachers said they played games on top of that often, 2 to 3 times per week. So again, it's around 80% of teachers saying that they're playing games multiple times a week. Again, 19% sometimes, once per week, 2% rarely, and perhaps not surprisingly, no teacher said never. Okay, so this is the next question we asked as part of this same study that's deeper dive into games. How do teachers incorporate maths games into their classroom routines and lesson structures? The first thing we wanted to look at is, do teachers use maths games outside of their maths class at all? So maybe end of the day before pack up, for example, or maybe in the morning or just before lunch, something like that. And this happened rarely or sometimes. So it might have happened once per week or once per month. Only a small number of teachers did this regularly. What about as a warm-up activity in a maths class? So the first thing we do in a maths class. Now this was very common. About a third of teachers did this for all their maths classes, pretty much. And another 45% did it often, 2 to 3 times a week. So three quarters of teachers are using a game as a warm-up multiple times a week. And then another 19% are doing it once per week. Okay, so only a very small number of teachers don't use games in this way. What about as the main learning activity in a maths class? Right, so this is a little less frequent. About half the teachers say they use a game as the main learning activity once a week, and about a third use it more frequently than that. Very few teachers just teach maths through games. What about as a closure in a maths lesson? So this surprised me a little bit. I thought it might be a bit higher. I often end with a game to close, particularly a whole of class game. But most of the time, teachers are only doing this maybe once a week or once a month. And only a small number of teachers are doing it more regularly than that. Last, to support rich mathematical investigations. And for me, this is quite heartening because this is how I love to use games. And the fact that almost half of teachers from this sample anyway said that they use games multiple times a week for an investigation is a really exciting finding from my point of view. But again, this could be because the teachers we asked about their views were particularly interested in games. Okay, what are teachers' pedagogical aims when using maths games? So what are their aims? So we asked teachers to indicate how they felt about each of these items, from strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. 100% of teachers agreed that they use games to engage students in maths lessons. So again, this is our first principle. It's not surprising that it's come up, right? 82% strongly agree with that, as in that's a primary reason why they're using games. Looking at maximizing on-task behavior, again, almost all the teachers agree or strongly agree that games are a good way of maximizing on-task behavior. And that's actually the case that 88% or 90% and around half, 50% for pretty much all the other items. So maximizing on-task behavior, generating those rich discussions, differentiating, focusing students on important mathematical ideas and supporting connections between home and school environment. So you may well recognize those dot points because they pretty much reflect our principles. So those first two ideas, engaging students and maximizing on-task behavior, that's pretty much principle 1. Generating rich mathematical discussions probably connects to that as well. Differentiating, that's probably principle 4. Focusing students on important mathematical ideas, principle 3. And supporting connections, that's our last principle. So skill and luck or balance doesn't really get reflected there, but the others do. Okay, the only one that wasn't sort of strongly endorsed of that bunch was supporting connections between home and school. Having said that, almost 3/4 of teachers still agree with that statement. And I have to emphasize that this survey went out before COVID. Okay, so I'm sure if we sent it out now, I'm pretty confident anyway that that item would be higher, as in more teachers would strongly agree or agree with it. And then you can lastly see, and this again was quite exciting for me, not what I expected, in terms of thinking about the proficiencies, the 4 proficiencies in the Australian curriculum, fluency, understanding, reasoning, and problem solving. Teachers agreed that, or strongly agreed that they pretty much used games for those 4 proficiencies equally in terms of their pedagogical aims. So games aren't just about fluency from a teacher's perspective. They actually are about reasoning and building understanding and developing problem solving skills. Right? So we shouldn't write games off as something that are used primarily as warm-ups. They're much richer than that, and teachers see the value in games. Okay, and lastly, we asked teachers what their favorite maths game was, and could they describe it in as much detail as possible. And when their description was rich enough, we extracted some information from their description to look at what materials were reflected in their favorite mathematical games. I think it's pretty interesting as well. 60% of games just involve dice or playing cards as their favorite mathematical games, teachers' favorite games. 17% just pen and paper. Okay, so games like Mastermind or a bingo style game where, for example, students have written down some potential products and I say something like 8 times 4. Is it on your bingo sheet? Or cross it off if it is. And I'm just coming up with stuff as a teacher. It's just a pen and paper game. 11% said oral games like Buzz, 21, those types of games. And they were pretty much the 3 main ones, but particularly dice and playing cards. You can see that the numbers drop off dramatically after that. Interesting that digital games, so computer games, were very rarely emphasized. So games like, Wishball, which is a game, I think, available through one of the education department resources, which is a really great game. Games like that only were mentioned by 3 teachers. So this is, for me, again, a really interesting point. The majority of the research in education that looks at maths games looks at computer games. Very few teachers are using computer games regularly as part of their mathematics instruction, or at least very few teachers think they're the best games, these computer games. So again, there's a massive disconnect there. Lots of research dollars and focus on computer games, and one of the reasons is, well, they have a commercial application, which is not irrelevant for research dollars, but also it's quite easy to do research with a computer game because you can hold a lot of things constant. You can vary something systematically, whereas it's much messier to investigate, actual games as they unfold in the classrooms. Computer games can be done in a lab. Again, a lot of education research, particularly educational psychology research and cognitive psychology research that informs education, is done in a lab. So again, big disconnect between practice. We need more messy research into how teachers use games in actual classrooms. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to reflect because there was a fair bit of research I went. And this is my last slide before we go to questions. So before I take questions, I'm going to give you a chance to reflect on this research, what stood out for you, and have a discussion about that with the person next to you. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thanks for coming back. Now, I'm conscious that we're running right to the end of our time here. So before I take any questions, I want to thank you for your participation in the session. Now, I'm assuming you participated. The reason I did it this way is because when I go to a conference, when I reflect at the end, I learn more from my conversations with my fellow conference delegates than I do from the presenters themselves most of the time. But the presenters are kind of planting ideas that I can then discuss and explore with people around me. So hopefully that worked. It's very hard for me to tell if it did, but hopefully you got something out of it. And if you want to read further about it, there's an article around the 5 principles, and there's an article around transforming games into investigations. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to any questions. And I guess the one thing I want to do, because I didn't get the name right at the start, is I want to thank Delegate Connect at my end for running this whole thing. It seems to have worked smoothly. And also thank MAWA for having me, because I've enjoyed myself even though I can't be there. All right, so I'll open up to questions. I'm not sure how well I'll be able to hear you, but I'll do my best. I know that we don't have a lot of time.
I'll relay the questions through. Has anyone got a question?
Strategy 6 or item 6 to the value of games, and you talked about investigating the game and how it operated and so on. Any thoughts on running simulations of the games using, for example, Excel spreadsheet, or perhaps a free to download code like Python? This would seem appropriate for years, at least years 5 and 6.
I think that is a fantastic idea. I think that's one of the things I've really enjoyed with Maths 300, was that we design our games, we play our games, we'd investigate. And even though the software is a bit old and clunky, the fact that you could then simulate a whole bunch of games, particularly if you're exploring probability, was really exciting. And particularly when you're thinking about the relationship between experimental probability and theoretical probability, and how one approaches the other, experimental approaches theoretical, as your sample size increases. So I think simulation is a fantastic idea for closing out an investigation, or possibly, and maybe this is what you're getting at, for something even more integral to an investigation. So I'm completely on board with that stuff. I don't know a lot about the software that's available out there. I haven't played with a lot myself, but I'm certainly open to it.
Questions? Okay, can you... Oh. Here we come.
Thank you very much for your previous answer. It was fantastic. This form of learning, why do we actually refer to them as games? Why call them games? Because, in terms of, it was interesting to note that in one of your survey questions, using sort of real world sort of a scenario or phenomenon was, I think, as low as 2%. And so when everything's a game, then there's this disconnect when we want to apply mathematics, perhaps to real world situations. The game is fun, but not the real thing, and yet we want to be able to apply our mathematics to the real thing.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question or comment. I think that it's not either or. I think we could be exploring real world scenarios and investigations, but I don't necessarily think that has to be incorporated into gameplay. There might be opportunities to do that, and I'll give you one obvious example. You could look at something like football, and AFL that is, and even though it's sort of contrived, you could invent a game, and there's plenty of games out there using dice or cards that simulate a football game. So it is connecting to the real world, but it's still a game in terms of how it plays out. But that's a reasonable point. I don't know of any research that looks at a similar game, one structure with a real world connection, one structure without it, and whether it impacts student engagement or how deeply they engage with the mathematics. But that actually would be a fascinating study. And if I ever get around to generating enough time, to be able to explore something awesome like that in the future, I will have a crack at it.
James. Can we join me in thanking James very much?